Good evening and welcome to the Carnegie Council. I'm David Speedy, Director of the Program on U.S. Global Engagement here at the Council. And this evening we have an unusual and I think you will find quite riveting program to offer you. Very briefly, the Education for Employment, whose principals we welcome here this evening, is the leading youth employment nonprofit in the Middle East and North Africa. It creates economic opportunity for unemployed youth through our globally recognized job training and placement, employability, and entrepreneurship programs. EFE, whom we welcome back to the Council, is basically at work in perhaps the most sensitive region of the planet and engaged in the most challenging task in that region, which is providing job opportunities for at-risk youth. Ron Bruder, the founder and chairman of the board of EFE, on the EFE website, the first line of his bio is, Ron Bruder is a serial entrepreneur. And Ron has brought the same spirit of entrepreneurship and creativity, and as he said, it's the greatest thing he's ever done. We look forward to hearing elaborations on that. Jasmine Nahasta-Florio is the Vice President for Strategy and Partnerships, and Jasmine has really a wide and varied and to EFE incredibly valuable career in business and law, in philanthropy, and public-private partnerships, and so on and so forth. So without further ado, let's get into the heart of this. Ron, tell us how it got started. What are the origins? What brought you to do this, and what has been the sort of a capsule summary of the evolution of EFE over the last decade or so?
Prior to thinking that the EFE should exist, I had been a serial entrepreneur, and I had built mostly shopping centers for many years. And 9/11 happened. Eldest daughter was by the World Trade Center. She watched the towers go down, and we spent the next several months discussing why it happened, what the motivation was, and what would happen next and what we could do about it. Among other entities that I started, I created a small pharmaceutical company. And it was licensing medical technologies and devices. And that took me to Ireland in the late 1990s. And I saw how the religious factions were constantly going at each other. Initially, when I went over there, everybody wanted to know if I was dealing with one religious group, like there's no way I could deal with the other. And some places were dangerous and needed to be avoided, and there was a lot of fear. And all that ended right around the year 2000, over about a 4 or 5 year period. And the cause behind its ending was basically the economy flourished. The Celtic Tiger roared, the GNP quadrupled, people had jobs and opportunity. And so as they said it to me, because I went back to find out, instead of killing each other, they were now making a killing together. So I believe that if the region, the Middle East, had the piece of the global pie, that the strife and the difficulties we're seeing would, quite frankly, diminish or vanish. And so we were looking for a way of creating stable societies and building the economy. So I brought on board some people that were a lot smarter than me in this area, an advisory board, and we hired the Brookings Institution and brought Martin Indyk into it. And what we learned was that basically the education in the region did not meet the needs of the labor market. And so, for instance, if you are a college grad in any one of the countries they operate in, the odds of you being unemployed are virtually doubled. And if you get a graduate degree, you clearly have diminished your opportunity. So you go to school, you have higher expectation, and at the end of the day, you have lower opportunity. And so we decided to do two things that I think were different. One is we built local foundations. You don't see us. You see a local chairman who's a leading businesswoman or man, you see a local board, you see local staff, and they figure out where the jobs are and what needs to be done. And so we also only train when we believe there are jobs at the end. So what goes on in the region is people get training and training, they have training fatigue, but they don't get the cheese, they do not get the job. We shoot for 85% of our graduates getting gainful employment. Last and not least, we also believe that training in women has much more social impact than training men. And so we put a big push on making most of our enrollees and graduates female. We give them preference. Sometimes that works well, sometimes it works less well. I think that statistically, 70% of our graduates in Morocco, in Tunisia are women, where it's only 38% in Yemen. But quite frankly, that's probably the highest number that anybody's ever achieved in Yemen, because there are very few women in the workplace. And so our goal is pretty straightforward. We believe that by training thousands and getting them employed, we not only can help the individuals, but we also can hopefully create a tipping point whereby the educational institutions that exist that are not functioning well are no longer accept their lack of creativity and employability of the graduates. And so we are beginning to see in some of the countries where we are being brought in on a much larger scale to help governments and training centers and universities whose placement record is quite frankly poor do a better job. And we hope this tipping point will result in a much more robust institution that actually gets its youth into the labor market, which I believe personally will be a major factor towards creating global peace.
Jasmine, would you follow up on a couple of things that Ron said? The first is the idea that education does not necessarily, in fact, it may be an impediment to employment. And so the first thing would be, say something a little bit more about matching skills to employers' needs. And then secondly, his point about your focus on women, and especially first jobs, the importance of first jobs. And I know you've had a recent initiative and a report forthcoming on the employment of women specifically, and you might be able to give us a sneak preview, as it were.
Sure. So we see there's basically two major gaps. There's the skills mismatch that you talk about. That's the mismatch between the skills that young people have when they come out of university or any kind of education system and what they need to get their first job. So there's a paradox where the majority of CEOs in the Middle East and North Africa who have been polled have said that they have great trouble finding the right skills at the right time. Entrepreneurs in the region have also said one of the biggest constraints to growth of their companies is the lack of skills. And yet, you've got the highest unemployment rate among young people on the planet. So it's a great challenge, but it's also a great opportunity. If we can resolve that market inefficiency, it's a great opportunity for young people to get their first job. The other gap that's not talked about as much is an opportunity gap. And it's especially important for young people who are excluded, who don't have family connections, who can get them that first job, who haven't gone to elite institutions. So what do we do to help excluded young people get their foot in the door and get their first job, which is the hardest step to take? And it's an ethical question as well. I want to just share a statistic and a story. 79% of millennials in the Middle East who have been polled by Bait.com have said the single biggest challenge facing their generation is finding that first job. And a sort of, I can share a story as well from a young person who came into our program in Tunisia who said he went to school, he got a master's degree, and the fact that he could not find a decent job after that made him hate his country. So we can see the tremendous challenge, but also, again, if we can solve these inefficiencies and close those gaps, there's great opportunity, which is what EFE focuses on. In terms of young women, the situation is actually much worse for young women. Like in the US, young women in the region are much more likely to be in university than young men. There are more women graduates, and yet only 17.5% of young women and women are in the labor market. So their unemployment rates are 3 times as high as men. There's an economic cost to that. There's also the question of economic and social justice and the need to include young women in the labor force. So based on EFE's own work and research, we've looked a lot into this question. Since the very beginning, thanks to Ron's vision, more than half of the youth are young women, so 53% of the job placements are young women. We also have focused on research with partners like Bait.com and YouGov in Dubai to look into what are the obstacles and the barriers for young women getting into their first job. And we found some interesting things. There's a knowledge gap, there's a benefits gap, and there's an expectations gap. Just to focus on one, employers who want to attract young women are offering what they think is the greatest benefit, but young women actually find it to be the least attractive and the least important, which is having a female supervisor. What they're looking for are flex time, they're looking for ability to work from home, to work part-time, to have support with transportation. And they're not getting that from their employers. It's actually quite similar to what we see with millennials across the world. So they're not listening to each other, and young people are not getting that foot in the door.
What do you think about the, beyond just the immediate work of EFE, the idea of youth as agents of change, as it were, for the region, for the extended region, where there's a link between the job prospects and, to some extent, sort of socio-political stability in the region? I mean, it seems obvious, but elaborate, if you will, on how this contributes to the potential stability in a largely unstable region.
Well, the youth bulge in the region is a two-edged sword. If these youth can find economic opportunity and find jobs, I think that's going to bode very well for the region. If they can't find decent employment opportunities, they're frustrated. In the region, you can't marry if you don't have a job, practically speaking. You live with your parents and you live an existence of somewhat shame, having delayed adulthood. And so these are not happy kids that are looking for meaning, looking for opportunity, looking for self-esteem. And if they have a job and they have a future, they're insulated from temptations to do things that are antisocial. Not only there, it's anywhere globally. If you look at societies that have been on the cusp of problems, the biggest issue is, do the youth have opportunity, do they not? And so we believe if we can be a force to help the youth find their way economically, we can create a much more stable, peaceful society.
Beyond the sort of immediate question of getting a job for individual youth, young people, what about I read somewhere in your material about the record of graduates of the program starting businesses. So there's a multiplier effect, isn't there? For it's not just creating one job, but they're actually budding entrepreneurs, as it were, or business startups take place, and that presumably employs other people.
We obviously focus on any route that we think is viable to create opportunity, create jobs, and one of the key areas is that these kids are entrepreneurial. They're traders. They have it in their blood, in their history, their DNA, and they're hungry. They want to be out there and they want to be creating businesses. You know, but like any other entrepreneurial adventure, there's a huge failure rate. So in our programs, we're very careful because we don't want to once again raise expectations and not have the youth find the opportunity that they need. So we will have programs where we'll have contests where hundreds, I think thousands now, of youth have submitted have business plans. And those that seem to are favorable, we help them fine-tune their business plans. Those that then seem to be more viable, the key element for an entrepreneur is money. And so we not only train them, but those that we think have an economic opportunity, we assist them and act as a catalyst for getting them their working capital. It's also worth saying that we have relationships now, large and small, with over 2,000 employers who hire anywhere between 1 to hundreds of employees per company.
Before we go to the audience, I think maybe the last thing I have to ask in the interest of fairness is that in addition to all the remarkable achievements in terms of years you've invested in this, the number of graduates, the multiplier effect, and so on and so forth, there have been some setbacks. I mean, what would you say has been the biggest, I don't know if the word is disappointment, but what have been the biggest sort of roadblocks you've hit over the years?
Well, the biggest roadblock I think we've had is recent. We had built a really robust foundation in Yemen. We had have a chairman by the name of Alwan Shaybani. He ran the Yemeni Airlines. He owns the DHL franchise, the Hertz franchise. He owns some of the nicest hotels, although I think recently one of them has been flattened. And so we built up this group, and we were training women and men, getting them into the labor market and showing that it could be done. And the sad thing there right now is the market is in disarray. And so therefore we're looking at it, we're trying to find a niche where our CEO flew to the US to discuss with us the fact that he wanted to create opportunity for nurses. A lot of the healthcare workers in Yemen were expats, and they've all gone elsewhere because they don't want to be there. And so that leads an opportunity, and we're evaluating that because we don't want to train unless at the end of the day our graduates can get jobs. So we're kind of trying to figure out whether that works. But the situation is so scary that he came to New York and spent some serious time with us, and then when he wanted to go home, he couldn't go home. You know, the airports were shut. He could not find his way back, and ultimately he's now back there, but it took several months and a lot of pulling and working to make things happen to give him the opportunity to go home. And he has 5 kids and clearly didn't want to be stuck in the U.S. I think that's our biggest challenge that we've ever had. But you know, on the other hand, we see buy-in from countries that previously were indifferent to us. Jasmine and our team have created amazing opportunities in countries like the Emirates. The Saudis are now clearly getting involved with us, and we're training us, and they're funding us with millions of dollars of donations to move us forward. We're about to go into Algeria. Because of the bad news, I think, there's a realization that the work we're doing is key to stable societies, and we're seeing much more buy-in, much more opportunity for us on a higher level. And so I think that's going to move us forward a lot quicker than otherwise.
Is it part of your ambition to have a catalytic effect with the local public training schools or universities or public education bodies? And if so, how do you see that working?
It's a great question. I mean, our ultimate vision is definitely to impact the system, systemic change, because even if we can reach 100,000 youth in jobs, it's still a drop in the bucket compared to the 100 million needed in the region, according to the World Bank by 2020. So we're already planting the seeds for that. We're working closely with ministries, with educational institutions, with universities in many of the countries where we operate, like Morocco and Tunisia and Jordan. In fact, we hire the trainers from those institutions to train in our classrooms. We embed some of our curricula into those institutions, and we work with them to bridge this gap of their graduates into jobs. So we're already working with them. The question is, how can we influence or inspire governments to fund this on a large scale in their own institutions? So that's something that we're under discussion in a number of the countries. In other countries, it's pretty difficult to work with the institutions. They're either not functioning at all, or it's hard to be in conversation with the government. But where we can, we're certainly doing that.
I tend to be an optimist, and I believe that we will, within the next few years, hit a tipping point in most of the countries we're operating where it becomes unacceptable, where it becomes common knowledge that if you go to an EFE program, you have an 85% chance or better or worse, but roughly in that neighborhood, of getting a job. And so therefore, we'll make it unacceptable to go anywhere else where you spend all your time, money, and effort, and you don't get a job. And I think we will, and are on the road to changing that and having broad changes in these countries as we become better known, as we become larger. And we've been growing very rapidly.
I was wondering if you have any market penetration in the rural areas of these countries. I'm assuming, of course, that you operate primarily in urban areas.
We do. I'd like to give you one example. A young woman from the interior of Tunisia, Dalal Samti, she defied all the odds and got an engineering degree from the interior, far from the big city, from Tunis or Sfax. And she was unemployed. Her classmates, they were all unemployed. And she came to our program. She got skilled up in soft skills, which is sort of the hardest skills to learn. It's what the CEOs across the region have said most young people do not have: communication, teamwork, leadership, work ethic, goal setting, that sort of thing. Worked on soft skills, also worked on construction project management, because although many of the young engineers are great at engineering concepts, they need to learn how to really work with people and run projects. So we taught her that. She got a job with CCC, one of our key employer partners, and she's now working in Dubai managing a group of 5 people. So she is from the interior of Tunisia. We have a lot of young people like that. In Egypt, the youth will travel an hour and a half every single day, each way, to come to our training program for 2 to 3 months. And we don't give transportation stipends. We, in fact, ask them to give a very small commitment fee to make sure that they are committed to stay the course, finish the training, and start their job. And many of those young people come from surrounding areas. In Palestine, thanks to our presence on Facebook, there was a group from the north near Hebron that said, "You're doing all this training in Ramallah, what about us?" And so within a few months, we did the training in their region as well.
I wanted to know if the logical extension would be to go to the multinationals, the American companies, and say, what skills do you need? What kind of jobs can we create that you would put into the Middle East to employ these people? Have you taken steps to do so, like the Apples, Googles?
Yes. Many of the tech companies don't hire in large numbers at all. Some of those companies have 1 or 2 people. They have a sales and marketing person in some of these countries. So we definitely are talking with the major American and Western multinationals, and there's a lot of interest in our work. It's more, I mean, the sectors that are hiring young people in large numbers for entry-level jobs are hospitality, so hotels and restaurants, retail, including online retail, construction, and ICT, information communication technology. So these are the 4 main sectors that the IMF has identified, and we've also seen where there's tremendous potential for young people. So the majority of our 2,000 employer partners are actually local, small and medium-sized enterprises and national companies in these countries. But we've just opened an office in Dubai, in part to reach and have access to multinationals, Indian, Emirati, Saudi, American, and others, who are making hiring decisions for the entire region. And we have that platform now up and running, so we'll be doing a lot more of that work. But we're very happy to say we are working with Pepsi, we're working with Marriott, we're working with a number of multinationals. They want to see a small pilot work with 25 people, and then if it works, when it works, they'd like to scale up to large numbers and across the region. So that's definitely something we've been working on over the past year.
Just as a follow-up to that, Jasmine, that, you've mentioned IT and technology and so on a couple of times in responses, and obviously the growth of technology and internet use in the region is critical for this. I mean, a very basic question: what about the hardware? What about the access to PCs, to laptops? I mean, to really, we are, to use the jargon, in an interconnected world. So how is that working in across the 8 client countries?
I mean, it's been a radical change since I started the foundation 10 years ago. In the past 10 years, Arab internet users have increased from 16 million to 90 million users. So they're getting access, especially in Saudi, in the Emirates, and Morocco, and these other countries. Also, we're seeing that online payments, e-retail, has increased by 45% annually, which is the largest growth on the planet. Again, tremendous opportunity. As a foundation, we've had to be really nimble and try to react quickly so that we can take advantage of this. And a couple examples, we've launched our first blended learning program in Jordan. Blended learning mean, how do we use online learning and integrate that in classroom? Because for the young people that we serve, in order for there to be transformational change in their habits and their soft skills, you need to have a lot of high contact, in-person time. So how do you combine that with online technology? So we call that blended learning. We bring the computers into the classroom, we bring the tech into the classroom, but there's still that personal touch. So we'd really like to scale up on the training side through blended learning. The question is then, how do we scale up on the demand side and make sure that we can get all those youth into jobs? When we started, we had no Facebook page at all. We now have 305,000 followers on Facebook across the region, and it's become the main mechanism for recruiting young people into our programs. The first program that we did in Palestine that I helped to start, we got the word out to the youth through the Career Center at the university. And now, as I said, 305,000 followers on Facebook. They find us. And when we post certain opportunities, like with Pepsi, we get massive surge in applications. So it's been really exciting. And then finally, the sector approach. I mentioned this is one of the 4 sectors that's really, really important for young people. And it's actually the one they really want to go into because they're excellent at tech, at social media, and there are a lot of opportunities for them in this space. So in terms of access, I think to your earlier point about rural areas, I mean, it's going to be much harder for youth in rural areas, but we find that in the big cities, the young people have access, either through cafes or on their mobile phones or in our classrooms or at universities. They're able to get access, at least in the cities.
The region generally is perceived as a very homogeneous block of countries, while it's composed of very, very different countries if we look more in depth. So what was, in the case of youth employment, what was the most striking nuance that you came across as you were working closely with those countries within the local context with regards of how they deal with the complexities of youth in employment and how they innovate to solve the issue.
A couple of thoughts in terms of the diversity. I mean, I feel so blessed to have been able to spend the past 10 years in the region because I didn't know it very well, and it is so different. Yemen is so different from Morocco. Even Morocco and Tunisia are so different. You know, the Gulf states are different. One thing that really surprised me is that in one country, the young women that we trained who wear a veil had difficulty finding a job because employers had stereotypes against these young women. This is in their own country. So that, to me, was absolutely profoundly shocking and surprising. And of course, we built that back into the program and needed to make sure we had a closer match between the youth and the employment they're seeking. In terms of connectivity, in some countries like Palestine, they're so small and they're so interconnected that it's pretty straightforward to get to federations of businesses. So for us to be much more efficient, we need to go to a small business federation that can be a platform for 1,000 SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. We need to go to the federation of businesses working in hotels or in a certain sector. So in Palestine, that's relatively straightforward to do, and we're doing it. In other countries like Egypt, where you have 90 million people, it's much, much harder to get that kind of connectivity. We're starting to do it, but it's much harder. So the business community is a little bit more disparate, harder to get people together. It takes an hour and a half to get anywhere in Cairo as well. So there's contextual difference on the employer side as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.